In a world where proving yourself means everything, sometimes the most powerful statement comes not from words, but from a single, perfect shot that echoes across a silent range and shatters every assumption in its path. What happens when years of doubt, dismissal, and discrimination collide with raw talent and unbreakable determination? Some stories are born in moments that last mere seconds but change lives forever. This is the true story of Sarah Chun, a woman whose journey from civilian to Marine sharpshooter would challenge everything her fellow Marines thought they knew about courage, skill, and what it really means to earn respect. In a place where reputation is built one shot at a time, Sarah was about to fire the shot heard around the entire base. Sarah Chun never imagined that her life would change forever on a dusty Tuesday morning at Camp Pendleton. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the Marine Corps base as she walked toward the shooting range, her boots creating small clouds of dust with each determined step. At 23, Sarah had already overcome more obstacles than most people face in a lifetime. But nothing had prepared her for what awaited her that day. Growing up in a small town outside Seattle, Sarah had always been different. While other girls her age spent their weekends at the mall or hanging out with friends, Sarah could be found in her grandfather's workshop, learning to fix engines, or in the backyard, practicing with the old hunting rifle he had taught her to use when she was just 12 years old. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran named James Chun, had seen something special in his granddaughter from an early age. Steady hands, steady mind, he would tell her as she lined up her shots at tin cans arranged on the fence behind their house. Shooting isn't about strength, Sarah. It's about patience, breathing, and seeing what others can't see. Those words would echo in her mind years later as she faced challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. Sarah's path to the Marines hadn't been conventional. After high school, she had worked various jobs, trying to find her place in the world. She waited tables at a diner, worked construction with her uncle's crew, and even spent 6 months as a mechanic at a local auto shop. Each job taught her something valuable, but none felt like her calling. It wasn't until her grandfather passed away during her 21st year that Sarah found her true direction. Going through his belongings, she discovered a box of old military photographs and letters. Images of young Marines in Korea, letters from fellow soldiers, and medals that her grandfather had never displayed publicly. Reading through his war correspondence, Sarah learned about a side of her grandfather she had never known. He had been a sniper, one of the best in his unit, credited with saving dozens of lives through his exceptional marksmanship. One letter particularly moved her. It was from a fellow Marine thanking her grandfather for a shot that had saved his entire squad from an enemy position. "Your steady hands and steady mind kept us all breathing today," the letter read. "I'll never forget what you did for us, and neither will my family back home." Sarah realized that her grandfather's lessons about shooting had been about much more than hitting targets. They had been about responsibility, precision, and the weight of life and death decisions. That discovery changed everything for Sarah. She decided to enlist in the Marines, driven by a desire to honor her grandfather's legacy and find her own purpose. The recruitment process had been straightforward enough, but from the moment she arrived at boot camp, Sarah encountered resistance that she hadn't expected. Boot camp at Paris Island had been brutal for everyone, but Sarah faced additional challenges that her male counterparts didn't. Some drill instructors seemed determined to prove that women didn't belong in combat roles. Others simply ignored her, as if acknowledging her presence would somehow compromise their authority. Sarah endured it all, pushing herself harder than anyone else, determined to prove that she belonged. During weapons training, Sarah's natural abilities began to show. She consistently outperformed her peers on the rifle range, earning perfect scores that even the instructors couldn't ignore. Her drill instructor, Sergeant Martinez, had initially been skeptical of having women in his platoon, but Sarah's performance slowly began to change his mind. "Chun," he had called out after one particularly impressive round of shooting. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" When Sarah explained about her grandfather's training, Sergeant Martinez nodded with what might have been respect. "Well, don't let it go to your head. One good day doesn't make a Marine." But it wasn't just one good day. Week after week, Sarah's scores remained at the top of her class. She helped struggling recruits improve their techniques, sharing the breathing methods and mental focus techniques her grandfather had taught her. Slowly, some of her fellow recruits began to see her not as an outsider, but as a valuable teammate. After graduating from boot camp with honors, Sarah had expected that the worst of the discrimination was behind her. She was wrong. Her assignment to Camp Pendleton brought new challenges and deeper prejudices than she had encountered during training. The base was home to some of the Marine Corps' most elite units, and many of the Marines stationed there had years of combat experience. To them, Sarah was just another fresh-faced recruit who happened to be female, someone who hadn't proven herself in real combat situations. The shooting range at Camp Pendleton was sacred ground for many of these veterans. It was where reputations were built and legends were born. The range had seen some of the best marksmen in Marine Corps history, and the walls were lined with photographs of record holders and Medal of Honor recipients. For many Marines, performing well on this particular range was a rite of passage, a way to earn respect among their peers. Sarah had been assigned to Bravo Company under Captain Williams, a fair but demanding officer who believed in giving everyone a chance to prove themselves. However, not all of his subordinates shared his open-minded approach. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who oversaw much of the company's weapons training, had made his feelings about female Marines clear from day one. "This isn't a game, and it's not boot camp," he had announced during Sarah's first company meeting. "Out here, your mistakes get people killed. We don't have time for social experiments or political correctness. You either perform at the highest level, or you find yourself transferred to a desk job somewhere safe." His words weren't directed specifically at Sarah, but everyone in the room understood the underlying message. The few women in the company were being put on notice that they would be held to impossible standards, and that any failure would be seen as proof that women didn't belong in combat units. Sarah's first few weeks at Camp Pendleton had been relatively quiet. She focused on learning her duties, understanding the base's protocols, and observing the dynamics among her fellow Marines. She quickly identified the informal power structure within Bravo Company and realized that earning respect would require more than just following orders and staying out of trouble. The shooting range was clearly the center of the social hierarchy. Marines who performed well there were treated with respect and included in important missions. Those who struggled found themselves assigned to menial tasks and excluded from the camaraderie that defined military life. Sarah knew that she would eventually need to prove herself on that range, but she also understood that timing would be crucial. The opportunity came sooner than expected. During her third week at the base, Captain Williams announced that the company would be conducting marksmanship evaluations for all personnel. These weren't just routine qualifications, but competitive assessments that would determine assignments for upcoming training exercises and potential deployments. "Everyone will shoot," Captain Williams explained during the briefing. "Scores will be posted publicly, and the top performers will have first choice for specialized training opportunities. This is your chance to show what you're made of." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was exactly the opportunity she had been waiting for, but she also knew that the pressure would be intense. All eyes would be on her, waiting for her to fail and prove their preconceptions correct. She thought about her grandfather's words about steady hands and steady mind, and she began to prepare mentally for what might be the most important shooting of her life. The night before the evaluation, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, visualizing the shooting process, controlling her breathing, and imagining perfect shots. Around her, other Marines were having similar thoughts, but for different reasons. Some were confident, others were nervous, but none faced the additional burden of representing an entire gender with their performance. As dawn broke over Camp Pendleton, Sarah dressed carefully, checking and rechecking her equipment. Her rifle was clean and properly zeroed. Her gear was organized and ready, and her mind was focused on the task ahead. She didn't know that this day would become a turning point not just for her own career, but for the perceptions of everyone who would witness what was about to happen. Walking toward the range that Tuesday morning, Sarah carried with her the weight of her grandfather's legacy, the hopes of every woman trying to succeed in a male-dominated field, and the quiet confidence of someone who had trained her entire life for this moment. She didn't know about the conversations that had taken place among some of the male Marines the night before, or about the bets that had been placed on her performance. She only knew that she was ready to show everyone exactly what she was capable of. The range was already buzzing with activity when she arrived. Marines were checking equipment, discussing tactics, and engaging in the kind of competitive banter that always preceded important evaluations. Sarah noticed that conversations seemed to quiet slightly when she walked by, and she could feel eyes following her movements. The attention didn't bother her. If anything, it focused her even more sharply on the task ahead. As she began to prepare her shooting position, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Every challenge she had faced, every doubt she had overcome, and every lesson her grandfather had taught her had led to this day. She was about to find out whether all of that preparation would be enough to silence the skeptics and earn the respect she had been fighting for since the day she first put on the Marine Corps uniform. The shooting range at Camp Pendleton stretched out before the assembled Marines like a test of character itself. 200 yards of carefully maintained lanes, with targets positioned at various distances, created an environment where precision and mental toughness would determine success or failure. Sarah Chun stood among her fellow Marines, feeling the familiar weight of her M16A4 service rifle and the less familiar weight of dozens of skeptical eyes watching her every move. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called the group to attention, his voice carrying across the range with military authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's evaluation will consist of 3 phases," he announced. Close-range precision at 50 yards, medium-range accuracy at 100 yards, and long-range marksmanship at 200 yards. Each phase will test different aspects of your shooting ability, and your combined score will determine your overall rating. As Rodriguez explained the scoring system and safety protocols, Sarah noticed the subtle dynamics playing out around her. Marines were naturally forming into groups, and she found herself somewhat isolated. It wasn't entirely unfriendly, but there was a clear sense that she was being evaluated differently than her male counterparts. Some Marines seemed genuinely curious about how she would perform, while others appeared to be waiting for confirmation of their preconceived notions. Corporal Mike Thompson, a stocky Marine from Texas with 3 combat deployments under his belt, leaned over to his friend Lance Corporal Davis. $20 says the girl doesn't make it past the first round, he whispered, loud enough for Sarah to hear. Davis, a younger Marine who seemed less certain, shook his head. "I don't know, man. I heard she shot expert in boot camp." Thompson snorted. "Boot camp is different. This is the real deal, with real pressure and real Marines watching. She'll fold." Sarah heard every word, but she had learned long ago not to let such comments affect her focus. Instead, she used them as motivation, channeling the negative energy into determination. She had faced similar doubt throughout her military journey, and each time she had proven the skeptics wrong. Today would be no different. The first phase began with Marines taking positions at the 50-yard line. This was considered the easiest distance, designed to build confidence and establish baseline accuracy. Sarah watched as other Marines took their turns, noting their techniques and observing how the wind conditions and lighting affected their shots. Several Marines performed well, scoring consistently in the high ranges, while others struggled with nerves or equipment issues. When Sarah's turn came, she approached the firing line with calm confidence. She had shot at similar distances thousands of times, both with her grandfather and during military training. The target seemed almost close enough to touch, and she knew that at this range, the primary challenges would be controlling her breathing and maintaining perfect sight alignment. "Lane 7, you may commence firing when ready," called the range safety officer. Sarah settled into her shooting position, feeling the familiar comfort of the rifle stock against her shoulder. She controlled her breathing, letting her heart rate settle into a steady rhythm, and began to line up her first shot. The first round left the barrel with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. Through her scope, Sarah could see the small black hole that appeared in the target's center ring. It was a perfect 10, placed exactly where she had intended. She worked the bolt smoothly, chambered another round, and repeated the process. Shot after shot, Sarah's rounds found their marks with mechanical precision. The Marines watching began to take notice, and conversations gradually quieted as her performance became impossible to ignore. By the time she had fired her 10th and Final round at the 50-yard target. Sarah had achieved a perfect score, placing all 10 shots in the highest scoring ring. Perfect score at 50 yards, announced the range officer, his voice carrying a note of surprise. A few Marines nodded approvingly, while others seemed stunned by what they had witnessed. Thompson, who had been so confident in his prediction of failure, stared at the target display in disbelief. "Lucky shots," he muttered, though his voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "Let's see how she does when the pressure really starts." The second phase moved the Marines back to the 100-yard line, where targets became smaller and wind conditions played a larger role in accuracy. This distance separated casual shooters from serious marksmen, as it required not just good technique, but also the ability to read environmental conditions and make precise adjustments. Sarah used the time between phases to observe the wind patterns on the range. She watched the grass movements, noted the direction of the range flags, and calculated how the crosswind might affect her bullet trajectory. These were skills her grandfather had taught her during countless hours of outdoor shooting, lessons that went far beyond basic marksmanship. When her turn came at the 100-yard line, Sarah made subtle adjustments to her scope settings and shooting position. The target looked significantly smaller from this distance, and she could see other Marines struggling to maintain their previous accuracy levels. Several had already dropped points due to shots that drifted outside the scoring rings. Sarah's first shot at 100 yards struck the target dead center, earning another perfect 10. The second shot followed suit, as did the third. By the halfway point of the string, it became clear that she was maintaining the same level of precision that had marked her performance at 50 yards. Marines who had been chatting among themselves began to gather behind the firing line, watching Sarah's shooting with growing amazement. "This is impossible," Thompson said to anyone who would listen. "Nobody shoots like this, especially not on their first evaluation here. She must be getting lucky, or there's something wrong with her equipment." But Sarah's shooting wasn't luck, and her equipment was standard Marine Corps issue, identical to what every other Marine was using. What she possessed was a combination of natural ability, exceptional training, and the kind of mental discipline that comes from years of dedicated practice. Each shot was the result of careful calculation, perfect technique, and unwavering focus. As she prepared for her final shot at 100 yards, Sarah became aware of how quiet the range had become. Even the range officers seemed to be paying closer attention than usual. The pressure of everyone's attention was intense, but Sarah had learned to use external pressure as a focusing tool rather than a distraction. Her final shot at 100 yards produced another perfect 10, giving her a second consecutive perfect score. The range officer's announcement of her results was met with a mixture of applause and stunned silence. Some Marines seemed genuinely impressed by her performance, while others appeared to be struggling with cognitive dissonance between what they had just witnessed and their preconceived notions about female Marines. Captain Williams, who had been observing the evaluation from a distance, approached the firing line with obvious interest. "Outstanding shooting, Chun," he said loud enough for nearby Marines to hear. "I haven't seen scores like that since my last deployment with Force Recon snipers." The comparison to Force Reconnaissance snipers, among the most elite marksmen in the military, sent ripples through the group of watching Marines. Force Recon Marines were legendary for their shooting abilities, and comparing a new Marine to their standards was not something Captain Williams would do lightly. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been notably silent during Sarah's shooting, finally spoke up. "The real test is at 200 yards, he announced. "That's where we separate the pretenders from the genuine marksmen. The target's smaller, the wind effects are magnified, and the pressure is real." His words carried a clear challenge, and everyone understood that the 200-yard phase would be the ultimate test of Sarah's abilities. At that distance, even experienced snipers occasionally struggled to maintain perfect accuracy. The margin for error became microscopic, and factors that were insignificant at closer ranges could easily cause missed shots. Thompson, desperate to maintain his credibility among his peers, raised his voice again. "I'm betting she chokes at 200. The pressure's getting to her already. Look at her hands." But when everyone looked, Sarah's hands appeared perfectly steady, and her demeanor remained calm and focused. As the evaluation moved to the final phase, Sarah could feel the tension building around her. What had started as casual skepticism had evolved into something more significant. Her perfect performance at the first two distances had forced everyone to reconsider their assumptions, and the final phase would determine whether her shooting was genuinely exceptional or simply the result of favorable conditions. Sarah understood the stakes as well as anyone. She had proven that she could shoot accurately at closer ranges, but the 200-yard challenge would test abilities that went beyond basic marksmanship. Success would establish her reputation among the Marines at Camp Pendleton and open doors to opportunities she had only dreamed about. Failure would confirm the doubts of her critics and potentially limit her future prospects. As she prepared for the most important shooting of her military career, Sarah thought about her grandfather's words about steady hands and steady mind. She thought about all the Marines who had questioned whether women belonged in combat roles, and about all the women who would follow in her footsteps. Most importantly, she thought about the responsibility that came with exceptional ability and the opportunity to change hearts and minds through superior performance. The 200-yard firing line awaited, and with it, the chance to silence the doubters once and for all. The walk from the 100-yard line to the 200-yard firing position felt longer than the actual distance to Sarah Chun. Each step carried the weight of expectation, doubt, and the growing realization that she had already exceeded everyone's expectations, including perhaps her own. The Marines around her were no longer making casual conversation about her abilities. The atmosphere had shifted from skeptical amusement to serious attention, and Sarah could feel the pressure building with each passing moment. At 200 yards, the target appeared significantly smaller through her scope, roughly the size of a dinner plate when viewed with the naked eye. The center scoring ring that had seemed so manageable at closer distances now demanded absolute precision in every aspect of the shooting process. Wind conditions that had minimal impact at 50 or even 100 yards could now push bullets completely off target. The slightest tremor in her hands, the smallest error in breathing technique, or a momentary lapse in concentration could result in a miss that would validate all the skepticism she had encountered. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez gathered the Marines around him before the final phase began. His weathered face bore the expression of someone who had seen countless Marines rise and fall based on their performance under pressure. 200 yards is where we find out what you're really made of, he announced. The fundamentals that got you here won't be enough anymore. This distance requires something extra, something that can't be taught in boot camp or learned from a manual. His eyes found Sarah in the group, and for a moment, she thought she detected something that might have been respect, or at least curiosity about how she would handle the ultimate test. The wind is picking up, Rodriguez continued, and the light is starting to change as we move toward afternoon. These are the conditions that separate good shooters from great ones. As if to emphasize his point, a gust of wind swept across the range, causing the red flags to snap and flutter more vigorously than they had during the earlier phases. Sarah studied the wind patterns, noting how the grass bent and recovered, how the flags moved in relation to each other along the range, and how the heat shimmer from the warming ground might affect her sight picture. Corporal Thompson had been unusually quiet since Sarah's perfect performance at the 100-yard line, but as the group prepared for the final phase, his need to maintain face among his peers overcame his growing doubt. 200 yards is a whole different game, he announced to anyone within earshot. I've seen Marines who shot expert their entire careers struggle at this distance. The margin for error is practically zero. Lance Corporal Davis, who had been watching Sarah's shooting with growing amazement, shook his head. Mike, maybe you should admit that she knows what she's doing. Those weren't lucky shots back there. Thompson's face reddened slightly. Look, I'm not saying she can't shoot. But 200 yards under pressure, with everyone watching, and with wind conditions like this, that's different than punching holes in paper at boot camp. This is where the real Marines prove themselves. Captain Williams, who had been observing the interactions among his Marines with interest, stepped forward. Thompson, since you seem so confident about the difficulty of this phase, why don't you shoot first? Show everyone how it's supposed to be done. The challenge was polite but unmistakable, and Thompson found himself in the position of having to back up his confident predictions with actual performance. He approached the firing line with less swagger than usual, clearly feeling the pressure of his own words and the attention of his fellow Marines. Thompson's shooting at 200 yards was competent, but not exceptional. He managed to keep most of his shots in the scoring rings, but several drifted toward the edges due to wind conditions and the increased difficulty of the distance. His final score was respectable for a Marine with his experience level, but it was far from the dominant performance his earlier words had suggested. As other Marines took their turns, a pattern began to emerge. The 200-yard distance was indeed challenging, and even experienced marksmen were struggling to maintain the accuracy they had demonstrated at closer ranges. Scores dropped significantly, and several Marines who had shot confidently at the shorter distances found themselves frustrated by missed shots and lower-than-expected results. Sarah watched each shooter carefully, not just to observe their techniques, but to learn from their successes and failures. She noticed that Marines who tried to rush their shots often pulled them off target, while those who took too much time overthinking each shot seemed to develop tremors that affected their accuracy. She observed how different shooting positions handled the wind conditions and noted which scope settings seemed to work best under the current lighting. When her turn finally came, Sarah felt a familiar calm descending over her. This was the moment her entire military career had been building toward, and she was ready for it. The doubts of others, the pressure of performance, and the significance of the moment all faded into background noise as she focused on the fundamentals that her grandfather had drilled into her years earlier. "Lane 4, you may begin when ready," announced the range safety officer. Sarah approached her firing position with deliberate movements, checking her equipment one final time and settling into a stable shooting stance. Through her scope, the target looked impossibly small, but she had hit smaller targets under more difficult conditions during her private practice sessions. The wind was gusty and unpredictable, requiring constant attention and adjustment. Sarah spent several minutes studying the conditions, watching how the wind affected the movement of grass and flags at different distances along the range. She made mental calculations about bullet drop, wind drift, and the timing of her shots to coincide with lulls in the wind. Her first shot at 200 yards required every skill she had developed over years of shooting. She controlled her breathing until her heart rate settled into a steady rhythm, aligned her sights with microscopic precision, and waited for the perfect moment when the wind conditions were optimal. The shot broke cleanly, and through her scope, Sarah could see the small black hole that appeared in the center of the target. The range fell silent. Even the Marines who had been chatting among themselves stopped talking to focus on Sarah's shooting. The significance of achieving a perfect 10 on the first shot at 200 yards was not lost on anyone. It demonstrated not just accuracy, but also the ability to read conditions and perform under maximum pressure. Sarah's second shot followed the same methodical process. She waited for the wind to settle, made minute adjustments to her aim point based on the conditions, and fired another round that found the center of the target. The watching Marines began to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary, a level of marksmanship that few of them had ever seen in person. By the fifth shot, word had spread throughout the range complex that something remarkable was happening on Lane 4. Marines from other units began to gather behind the firing line, and even some of the range officers left their posts to observe Sarah's shooting. The pressure of the additional attention was intense, but Sarah had learned to use external pressure as a focusing tool rather than a distraction. Shot after shot, Sarah's bullets found their marks with mechanical precision. Her technique remained consistent, her mental focus never wavered, and her ability to read and compensate for environmental conditions impressed even the most experienced marksman watching. With each perfect shot, the skepticism that had surrounded her since arriving at Camp Pendleton began to crumble. Corporal Thompson stood behind the firing line, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "This is impossible," he whispered to Davis. "Nobody shoots like this. Even our snipers don't maintain this kind of accuracy under these conditions." But Davis was beginning to understand what he was witnessing. "Maybe that's because most people don't have whatever she has," he replied. "Look at her technique, Mike. Look at how calm she is. This isn't luck or beginner's fortune. This is skill." As Sarah prepared for her final shot at 200 yards, the range had become completely silent except for the sound of wind through the grass and the distant sounds of training exercises on other parts of the base. Everyone understood they were witnessing something special, a performance that would be talked about for years to come. The final shot required the same methodical preparation as all the others. Sarah studied the wind conditions, made her calculations, controlled her breathing, and waited for the perfect moment. When the shot broke, it was with the same clean precision that had marked all her previous rounds. Through her scope, Sarah could see the 10th perfect hole in her target, completing a shooting performance that defied belief. She had achieved a perfect score at all three distances, demonstrating a level of marksmanship that even the most experienced Marines rarely witnessed. The announcement of her perfect score was met with stunned silence, followed by spontaneous applause from the gathered Marines. Even Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been skeptical of her abilities from the beginning, shook his head in amazement. "In 20 years of supervising range qualifications," he announced, "I have never seen shooting like that." Captain Williams approached Sarah with obvious admiration. "Chun, that was exceptional shooting by any standard. I'm going to be making some phone calls about your performance today. There are opportunities available for Marines with your level of ability." As Sarah secured her weapon and prepared to leave the firing line, she noticed that the atmosphere around her had completely changed. Marines who had been skeptical or dismissive earlier were now approaching with respect and curiosity. The shooting had accomplished something that months of trying to fit in could never have achieved. She had earned their respect through superior performance, proving that skill and dedication transcended any preconceived notions about gender or background. But even as Sarah savored the moment of triumph, she knew that this was just the beginning. The perfect shooting performance had opened doors, but it had also raised expectations. From this moment forward, she would be held to the standard she had just established, and every future performance would be measured against this remarkable day. The days following Sarah Chen's extraordinary shooting performance brought changes that rippled through Camp Pendleton like stones thrown into still water. Word of her perfect scores at all three distances had spread beyond Bravo Company, reaching the ears of senior officers, specialized units, and Marines across the base who prided themselves on their marksmanship abilities. For Sarah, the attention was both gratifying and overwhelming, as she found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never expected to occupy. Captain Williams had made good on his promise to make phone calls about Sarah's performance. Within 48 hours of the range evaluation, Sarah received orders to report to the Scout Sniper Platoon for assessment and potential training opportunities. The Scout Sniper program represented the pinnacle of Marine Corps marksmanship, and being selected for evaluation was an honor that few Marines ever received. The Scout Sniper compound was located in a restricted section of the base, surrounded by fencing and security measures that reflected the sensitive nature of the training conducted there. As Sarah approached the gate, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Everything she had worked toward since enlisting had led to this moment, and she understood that the next few hours would determine the trajectory of her military career. Gunnery Sergeant Harrison, the platoon's senior instructor, was waiting for her at the compound entrance. He was a lean, weathered Marine with the quiet confidence that came from decades of military service and countless deployments. His reputation as one of the Marine Corps' finest snipers was legendary, and Sarah felt honored to be meeting with him personally. "Chun," he said by way of greeting, his voice carrying the kind of authority that required no volume to be effective. "I've been hearing interesting things about your shooting. Captain Williams tells me you shot a perfect score at yesterday's evaluation under less than ideal conditions." Sarah stood at attention, unsure how to respond appropriately. "Yes, Gunnery Sergeant. The conditions were challenging, but I was able to maintain accuracy throughout the evaluation." Harrison studied her for a moment, his experienced eyes taking in everything from her military bearing to the way she carried her equipment. "Perfect scores are rare, Chun, especially at 200 yards with wind conditions like yesterday's. In my experience, that level of performance requires more than just good training. It requires natural ability and the kind of mental discipline that can't be taught." He gestured for her to follow him into the compound, and Sarah found herself walking through an environment that felt different from the rest of the base. Everything was meticulously maintained, from the perfectly aligned equipment to the spotless classrooms where advanced marksmanship theory was taught. Photographs of distinguished graduates lined the walls, Marines who had gone on to serve in the most elite units in the military. "Tell me about your background," Harrison said as they walked. "Where did you learn to shoot?" Sarah explained her early training with her grandfather, the countless hours of practice in the backyard, and the lessons about breathing, mental focus, and environmental awareness. Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as she described techniques that clearly aligned with advanced sniper methodology. "Your grandfather taught you well," Harrison said when she finished. "Many of the fundamentals you described are things we spend weeks teaching experienced Marines. The fact that you learned them as a child and have been practicing them for years gives you a significant advantage." They entered a classroom where several other Marines were seated, each wearing the distinctive Scout Sniper pin that marked them as graduates of the program. Sarah recognized the achievement those pins represented and felt humbled to be in such company. These Marines had proven themselves in combat situations where precision shooting meant the difference between mission success and failure. "Gentlemen," Harrison announced, "this is Lance Corporal Chun, the Marine who shot perfect scores yesterday at the company evaluation. I've asked her here to assess her potential for our program." The reaction in the room was mixed. Some Marines nodded with what appeared to be respect, while others seemed skeptical that a new Marine, particularly a female one, could possess the skills necessary for sniper training. Sarah had expected this reaction and was prepared to prove herself through performance rather than words. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had also arrived at the compound, having been invited to observe Sarah's assessment. His presence added another layer of significance to the evaluation, as his opinion carried weight with the Scout Sniper instructors. Since her perfect shooting performance, Rodriguez had been noticeably more respectful in his interactions with Sarah, but she sensed he was still evaluating whether her abilities were genuine or somehow circumstantial. The assessment began with a comprehensive examination of shooting fundamentals. Harrison and his instructors evaluated everything from Sarah's weapon handling procedures to her understanding of ballistics and environmental factors. They tested her knowledge of range estimation, wind reading, and the mathematical calculations required for long-range precision shooting. What impressed the instructors most was not just Sarah's technical knowledge, but her intuitive understanding of the subtle factors that affected long-range shooting. When asked to estimate the range to a distant target, her answer was within meters of the actual distance. When questioned about wind compensation, she correctly identified not just the primary wind direction, but also the thermal currents and eddies that could affect bullet flight. "Chun," one of the instructors said after observing her technique, "where did you learn to read environmental conditions like that?" Most Marines take months to develop that level of awareness. Sarah credited her grandfather's training and the years spent shooting in varying outdoor conditions. "He taught me that shooting was only partly about the rifle," she explained. "Most of it was about understanding the environment and making the right calculations. He said that nature was always trying to affect your shot, and